I used to believe that nothing in this old library could surprise me. The cracked tiles in the lobby, the smell of dust that clung to the wooden shelves, the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Everything was familiar, a rhythm of routine I leaned on when life outside grew too heavy. On weeknights, after finishing my day at the elementary school, I stayed late to help children from the neighborhood with their homework. Their laughter was often the only bright sound in a city that felt dimmed by hardship. Detroit had never been kind to dreamers, and yet here I was, still clinging to the hope that a small act of teaching could change something. That night, I was just packing up crayons and worn math books when the double doors opened. The hinges groaned like they hadn't been used in years, and suddenly the quiet chatter in the room hushed. Even the children stopped fidgeting with their pencils. A man stepped inside, and the air shifted in a way I can't fully explain, like every molecule rearranged itself to make space for him. He wore a navy suit, pressed so perfectly that the creases looked like blades. His hair, streaked with silver at the temples, seemed sculpted to command attention. I recognized him instantly. Jonathan Reed, the mayor of Detroit, heir to a political dynasty that had shaped the city for decades. His face appeared in newspapers often, but in person, he radiated something heavier, an authority that didn't need to raise its voice. The head librarian rushed forward, flustered, muttering about the honor of his presence. I stood frozen at the back of the room, clutching a stack of notebooks, trying to make sense of why someone like him would appear here, in this decaying corner of the city. He wasn't here for the peeling walls or the outdated encyclopedias. Then I saw it. In his right hand, he carried a book. Not just any book, but one bound in faded brown leather, its edges worn thin as though generations of hands had turned its pages. My throat tightened, because I had seen that exact book before. Not a similar one, not something resembling it. The same. My father's most treasured possession sat on his bedside table at the hospital. He'd guarded it like a relic, refusing to part with it even as medical bills swallowed us whole. I knew every scratch on its cover, every faded line of the golden trim, and more than that, I knew the inked inscription on the inside cover. A line of handwriting so peculiar, so haunting, that I could never forget it. To the rightful heir, may truth guide you. D.P. And now that very book, or something impossibly identical, rested casually in the mayor's hand. I felt a surge of disbelief so strong it made me step forward without realizing it. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than the children whispering around me. I shouldn't have said anything. I should have swallowed the shock, stayed silent like everyone else who kept their distance from power. But the words slipped out before I could catch them. Sir, my father has a book just like that one. The sound of my own voice startled me. It rang clear across the room, echoing against the high ceilings. Jonathan Reed stopped mid-stride. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. His eyes were sharp, an icy blue that seemed to slice through my skin, searching for the source of the interruption. What did you say? His tone was measured, calm, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to obedience. I swallowed hard, my cheeks burning. The book in your hand. I've seen it before. My father owns one with the same inscription inside. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. He glanced down at the leather cover, then back at me. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Surprise, annoyance, maybe even fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came. That's impossible, he said at last, his voice like a closing door. This volume is unique. It has been in my family for generations. The way he said it left no room for debate, yet I felt a fire rising in my chest. Impossible or not, I knew what I had seen with my own eyes. My father had shown me that inscription when I was a child, telling me it was proof of a promise no one else understood. I wanted to argue, to insist, but the mayor had already turned his gaze away, dismissing me as though I were a child making up stories. He handed the book to the librarian as if nothing had happened, as if my words were nothing more than dust motes in the air. But I couldn't let it go, because in that single moment, with that single sentence, something had cracked open. A book that should not have existed twice now lived in two worlds, his and mine. And deep down, I sensed it was more than coincidence. It was the beginning of a truth that had been buried, a truth my family was somehow entangled with. I didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the dim light and the strain of a long day had played tricks on me. But as the mayor continued his speech about revitalizing the community, I couldn't focus on a single word. My gaze kept drifting to that book, now resting on the table beside him, like a silent accusation. I remembered the first time my father had let me hold his copy. I must have been 10 years old. The hospital visits hadn't started yet. Back then, he still had the strength to spend hours reading. He sat me down at the kitchen table, placed the book in front of me, and said in a voice low with reverence, "This isn't just paper and leather, Maya. It's proof that promises matter." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I only traced the faded gold lettering and wondered why his eyes looked wet, as if the weight of the book pressed on him more heavily than it did on me. Now, watching Jonathan Reed flip through his copy without a hint of care, I felt that same weight settling on me. If my father's book was proof, then what was this? A copy? An imposter? Or was mine the one that wasn't supposed to exist? The children around me had already lost interest, returning to their coloring books and puzzles. To them, the mayor was just another adult in a suit, another face on TV. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. My heart still raced from the way he'd looked at me, that flash of warning in his eyes when I dared to mention the inscription. When the event ended, polite applause filled the library. Jonathan shook hands, posed for photographs, and then swept out the door with his aides trailing behind. The room slowly returned to its usual quiet hum, but nothing felt the same. I stayed behind, stacking chairs, my hands trembling. Chloe, another volunteer, gave me a questioning look. "What was that about?" she whispered, glancing toward the table where the mayor had stood. "Nothing," I said too quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a mistake." But it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't control. On the bus ride home, I pressed my forehead against the cold window, replaying the moment over and over. His words, "That's impossible. This volume is unique." They echoed in my mind, clashing against my memories of my father's voice reading the very same inscription aloud. What if the mayor was right? What if my father's book was the fraud? The thought twisted in my stomach. My father, who had sacrificed everything, who lived now tethered to machines in a hospital room, could he have clung all these years to something stolen, something that didn't belong to him? The possibility made me sick. Yet so did the alternative, that the powerful family of Jonathan Reed had lied, that they had concealed something bigger, and my father had been holding on to a truth too dangerous to speak. I didn't know which thought frightened me more. That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside my apartment buzzed with sirens and distant music, but inside, it was only me and the echo of a question that refused to quiet. How can two books carry the same promise? I pulled out my phone, searching the internet for any mention of rare editions, duplicate printings, anything that might explain it. But the more I searched, the less I found. It was as if the book didn't exist at all. No listings in antique catalogs, no references in university archives. Nothing. The doubt gnawed at me until dawn. I pictured my father in his hospital bed, the book resting on the table beside him, just within reach of his trembling hand. He always said it was more than an heirloom, it was a legacy. But legacy of what? By morning, one thing was clear. Silence was no longer an option. I couldn't ignore the look in Jonathan Reed's eyes, the sharp fear that flickered there when I spoke. People like him didn't fear accidents. They feared exposure. And if my father's book was a threat to a man like that, then maybe it was more than just an old volume of poetry. Maybe it was the key to something buried, something my family had been forced to carry in secret. I didn't know what the truth was yet, but I knew this much. I had stepped onto a path I couldn't turn away from. The book had chosen me the moment I spoke its secret aloud, and now I would have to follow it, wherever it led. By the time I reached the hospital that evening, the hallways smelled of disinfectant and tired resignation. I had walked them so many times that I could have traced every crack in the linoleum with my eyes closed. The rhythm of beeping monitors and muffled voices was familiar, almost cruelly so, because nothing in those sounds ever promised hope. My father's room was at the end of the corridor, by the window that looked out over the parking lot. The blinds were half open, slanting the last rays of daylight across his bed. He lay propped against a stack of pillows, thinner than I remembered even from last week. His skin had the pale translucence of someone who had fought too long against his own body. Yet when he saw me, the corner of his mouth lifted into a weary smile. "You're late, teacher," he whispered, his voice more air than sound. I set my bag down and kissed his forehead. The library kept me longer than I expected. I didn't tell him why. I didn't tell him about the man in the navy suit, or the way my heart nearly stopped when I saw that book in his hand. Not yet. On the nightstand beside him, just where it always sat, was his copy. The same leather-bound volume, edges worn soft, the gold trim barely clinging to the cover. He reached for it instinctively, like a man reaching for a compass. His fingers lingered on it as if its touch steadied him more than the IV line that ran into his arm. "You know," he said, almost absently, "I've been reading the same few pages over and over. I think I've memorized every line." I pulled up a chair and tried to match his smile. "It must be comforting." "It is," he murmured, "but not for the words, for what it carries." My gaze fell to the inscription inside, though I didn't open it. I knew every curve of those letters. "To the rightful heir, may truth guide you." DP. The sentence had followed me since childhood like a shadow. And now, after last night, it felt less like a blessing and more like a riddle I couldn't solve. I wanted to ask him outright. I wanted to demand where the book had come from, why another man, one of the most powerful in the city, claimed to own the same unique artifact. But the way my father's hand trembled as he turned a page stopped me. His body was fragile, but so was his peace. Instead, I asked softly, "Dad, where did you really get this?" He looked up at me, and for a moment his eyes sharpened, the old engineer's mind still alive inside the failing shell. Then he exhaled, leaned back against the pillows, and said with a small shrug, "It was a gift. From a friend." Something in his tone told me not to push further. His smile was gentle but guarded, as if he had closed a door before I could step through it. "A friend?" I repeated, my voice almost breaking. "Who?" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you keep it safe." His hand rested on the cover with finality. "Some things survive not because they are useful, but because they are true. Remember that." I nodded, though inside my chest questions were piling up like storm clouds. Why would the mayor insist his family's copy was unique? Why would my father cling to the same book as though it were his lifeline? And why did his answer sound like the end of a story instead of the beginning? The machines beside him beeped steadily, pulling me back to the room, to the reality of his fragile body. He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him, and I sat in silence watching his chest rise and fall. My hand hovered over the book, not daring to open it but feeling its weight, its quiet demand for answers. Through the thin walls of the hospital, I could hear a television playing down the hall. The news anchor's voice carried faintly, mentioning the mayor's appearance at the library. My stomach clenched. It was as if the world outside was conspiring to remind me of the collision I had just stepped into. I thought of Jonathan Reed's cold eyes, the way he dismissed me with certainty. And I thought of my father's trembling hand, clutching this book like a shield. Two men, two worlds, and one object binding them together in a knot I couldn't untangle. That night, sitting by his bedside, I understood that silence would not protect him, or me, forever. The truth was already pressing in from both sides, and no matter how much my father wished to keep the past buried, I felt the ground shifting beneath us, warning me that what had been hidden was about to surface. I reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. His eyes flickered open for just a moment, soft and tired, and he whispered, "Don't carry my battles, Maya. Live your life." But I knew it was too late. His battles were mine now, whether I wanted them or not. That night, after leaving the hospital, I walked home through streets that felt older than the city itself. Neon signs flickered above shuttered storefronts, and the cold air carried the metallic bite of November. Every step echoed with the words my father had whispered, "Don't carry my battles, Maya." As if I had a choice. I barely slept. Instead, I found myself at the small desk in my apartment, staring at the ceiling until memories began to seep back, fragments of a childhood I hadn't thought about in years. When I was little, my father used to read from that leather book every Friday night. He never chose fairy tales or bedtime stories. He always returned to the same pages, the same passages. Sometimes his voice trembled, not from fatigue, but from something deeper. Reverence, fear, maybe both. I remembered one evening in particular. I must have been 9. The lights in our kitchen had dimmed to a warm amber, and he sat across from me, the book open between us. He pointed to the inscription, "To the rightful heir, may truth guide you. DP," and tapped it gently with his finger. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. I shook my head, more interested in the chipped edge of the table than the strange letters. He leaned closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret with the walls. "It means that one day someone will have to remember what was lost. This isn't just ink, Maya. It's a promise that someone tried to erase." "Erase what?" I asked, confused. He closed the book softly, his eyes far away. "A man's place in the world. A man named Daniel." It was the first and last time I heard him say the name. Over the years, whenever I tried to bring it up, he brushed it aside, telling me not to worry about stories from the past. But I couldn't forget the way he said it, like the name carried both loyalty and pain. Now, as an adult, the memory returned sharper, heavier. Who was Daniel? Why had his name been attached to a book that my father guarded like a holy relic? I pushed back from the desk and walked to the small shelf where I kept my journals. Buried between stacks of old notebooks, I found one from middle school. Inside, in the loopy handwriting of a 12-year-old, I had scribbled fragments of conversations with Dad. And there it was. Dad says the book was given to him by a man who lost everything. His name was Daniel. He said Daniel wanted the truth to live, even if he didn't. Reading it now made my skin prickle. Even back then, I must have known the story mattered, enough to write it down. I sat back, clutching the journal, and my thoughts drifted once again to Jonathan Reed. The way his eyes had hardened when I mentioned the book. The way he dismissed me with such finality. Impossible. That was his word. Impossible. But if Daniel was real, If my father had carried his memory all these years, then nothing about this was impossible. It was hidden, and there's a difference. I closed the journal, my heart pounding. I felt the weight of my father's silence pressing on me. He had carried this secret for decades, but the cracks were showing now. His illness, his age, they were stripping away the barriers he had built to protect me. And whether he wanted it or not, the story was slipping into my hands. I thought again of that night at the library, of the two books that shouldn't have coexisted. Two artifacts, one inscription, one man's name. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a message, a whisper from the past, urging me to keep digging. I looked out the window, across the rooftops of the city. The skyline pulsed with lights, indifferent to the secrets that had shaped it. Somewhere out there, Jonathan Reed was sitting in his high-rise office, confident that history belonged to him. But he hadn't grown up listening to those whispers. He hadn't seen his father's hands tremble as he protected a book that should have been forgotten. I had. And I knew, in that quiet moment, that I would not let the name Daniel be erased again. The first crack in the wall of silence had opened, and soon, the whole structure would start to fall. I didn't see Jonathan Reed for several days after the library encounter, but that didn't mean he vanished from my mind. On the contrary, his presence lingered like the echo of a slammed door. Every time I thought of the book resting on my father's nightstand, I saw his cold eyes insisting it was impossible. Yet in the quiet corners of my imagination, I began to picture him in his own world, the marble halls of privilege, the silence of locked rooms where history was rewritten to fit a dynasty's pride. I imagined him that evening in his family's estate outside the city. The Reeds owned a mansion of stone and iron that looked more like a fortress than a home. My father used to call it the Citadel, though I never knew if he was joking or bitter. Inside, portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, each painted face watching like a jury across time. Somewhere in that mansion, Jonathan must have sought answers of his own. I could almost see him descending into the family archive, a place whispered about in old articles, rows of cabinets filled with ledgers, correspondence, and photographs dating back a century. A curated memory bank, guarded as fiercely as the vault of a bank. What struck me, as I pictured it, was the idea that even men like him weren't immune to doubt. He had brushed me aside at the library, yet something in his expression told me my words had lodged deeper than he intended. Otherwise, why would a man of his stature even bother with dusty boxes of paper? In my mind, I followed him through the archive's heavy doors. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed for the first time in years. He opened a drawer of brittle letters. The ink faded, but the intent still sharp. At first, it was the expected record. Building permits, campaign donations, property deeds. All the machinery that had built the Reed dynasty into what it was. But buried among the folders, he found something that didn't match the polish. A letter written in a frantic hand, dated decades ago. Daniel is the key. He cannot be allowed to speak. Protect the name. The words must have burned into him, because Daniel was not a name that appeared in the official history. Every biography of the family tree was precise, as though pruned to perfection. Alaric Reed, the founder. His son William, the empire builder. No Daniel. No shadow. I wonder if Jonathan paused in that moment, staring at the page, feeling the same confusion that haunted me, because it was one thing to hear my father whisper about a forgotten man. It was another to see the family's own ink confirm the ghost's existence. I don't know how long he stayed in that room, but I can imagine the weight pressing down on him. The archives weren't supposed to raise questions. They were supposed to settle them, to remind him that his legacy was built on iron and certainty. And yet here it was, a crack in the wall, as fragile as the thin paper in his hand. When I thought of him there, standing between the shelves of secrets, I didn't see just a politician anymore. I saw a man forced to confront the possibility that his inheritance was rotten at the core. Maybe that's why, days later, he returned to me. Maybe that's why the man who dismissed me at the library would eventually appear again, this time not with the arrogance of authority, but with the unease of someone who realized he might need me. At the time, though, all I had were fragments. My father's guarded silence, my childhood memory of the name Daniel, and the image of Jonathan Reed alone in that archive, staring at the truth his ancestors had tried so hard to bury. I told myself it was only imagination, but sometimes, when you've grown up surrounded by secrets, you can sense when another person has just uncovered their own. That night, sitting by the window of my apartment with my father's book open on my lap, I traced the inscription with my finger. To the rightful heir, may truth guide you. For the first time, I wondered if Jonathan Reed had read the same words, not in my book, but in the archives of his own family, words that no longer fit the story he had been told. And if that was true, then our paths were already bound together, not by choice, but by inheritance. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. Detroit is a city that can feel enormous and invisible all at once, yet sometimes it shrinks at the wrong moment. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind of night when the cold air carried the smell of fried food from the corner diners. I had just left the hospital, my father dozing under a thin blanket, his breathing shallow but steady. The elevator ride down had left me heavy, and all I wanted was to disappear into the anonymity of the crowd. But as I stepped outside, there he was, Jonathan Reed. He wasn't surrounded by aides this time. No polished entourage, no cameras. Just a man in a dark coat, standing beside a black sedan with the kind of stillness that makes you notice him even if you don't want to. Our eyes met before I could look away. Maya Holbrook, he said, my name rolling off his tongue as if he had been practicing it. I froze. He shouldn't have known my name. I had never offered it. How do you know who I am? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. His expression didn't shift. I did my research. The words chilled me more than the wind. Research. That meant files, background checks, maybe even the hospital records. He had pried into the life I was barely holding together. I wanted to walk past him, to let the night swallow me, but anger rooted me in place. And what did you find, Mr. Reed? That I volunteer at the library, that I pay bills late, that my father is too proud to ask for help? Congratulations, you've cracked the mystery. For the first time, a flicker of discomfort passed through his face. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. This isn't about you, he said finally. It's about something bigger. Your father. That book. The connection you claimed at the library. I cut him off. Not claimed? Remembered. There's a difference. His jaw tightened. He reached into his coat, and for a moment my heart slammed against my ribs. But it wasn't a weapon he pulled out. It was a photograph, yellowed at the edges. He held it out to me. I hesitated, then took it. The picture showed a group of men in front of a factory, hard hats, grease-stained overalls, the sepia tone of the 1960s. On the back, in faded ink, were 3 words. Daniel stood apart. I stared at it, confused. Why are you showing me this? Because it was hidden in my family's archives, he said. His voice was lower now, less certain. And because the name Daniel keeps appearing where it doesn't belong. In your father's past. In mine. I need to know why. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't the dismissive politician from the library. This was a man cornered by a history he couldn't explain. I should have pitied him. Instead, I felt anger swell again. You think I'm your key? Is that it? That my father's suffering exists only to solve your puzzle? Let me tell you something. My father gave up everything: his health, his career, his peace, because of men like yours. You can chase ghosts all you want, but don't drag me into your guilt. For a moment, I thought he would walk away, but then he did something unexpected. He reached for his hand, tugged off a silver ring, and held it between us. This ring, he said, was passed down through the reeds for nearly a century. They told me it was unique, singular. But if your father's book is what I think it is, then maybe nothing I was told was true. The ring caught the streetlight, its crest faint but unmistakable, a symbol I had traced with my finger countless nights in my father's book. My breath caught in my throat. I hated myself for it, but the sight shook me. Proof. Not words, not memory. Something I could touch. Jonathan must have seen the change in my face. You recognize it, he said quietly. I forced myself to steady my voice. I've seen it before. We stood in silence, the city noise moving around us like we were trapped inside a bubble. Finally, he slipped the ring back on. Then we're both in this, whether we want to be or not. I shook my head. Number. I'm not in anything. My only responsibility is to protect my father. Whatever legacy you're chasing, it's yours to wrestle with. I turned to leave, but his voice followed me, low and firm. Maya, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. And when it rises, you'll have to decide which side you're on. I didn't answer. The photograph still burned in my hand, the faded ink like a whisper I didn't want to hear. As I walked into the night, one thought haunted me. Maybe he was right. Maybe the past wasn't done with us. And maybe the collision we'd just had was only the first crack in the dam. When I was a child, my father's voice was the safest place I knew. Even when money was thin and the roof leaked, his voice wrapped around me like a promise. But now, sitting at the edge of his hospital bed, I realized how much he had hidden behind that same steady tone. The room was dim. Machines clicked in rhythm. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers. I had slipped the photograph into my coat pocket, but its weight pressed against me like a secret too loud to ignore. Dad, I said softly, careful not to wake the man in the next bed. His eyes opened, heavy with exhaustion, but sharp enough to know I wasn't here just to sit in silence. You're wearing that look, he murmured. His voice rasped like old paper. The one you used to have when you caught me sneaking cookies from the jar. I almost laughed, but the ache in my chest was too heavy. I saw someone tonight. Jonathan Reed. He knew about you. About us. My father's brow furrowed. Reed. His lips pressed into a thin line as if the name itself tasted bitter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo. The old image trembled in my hands as I held it out. Do you know this? He studied it, his breathing slowing. For a long time he said nothing. Then he closed his eyes as if retreating into a place only he could see. Daniel, he whispered. The name sent a shiver through me, the very same name Jonathan had spoken in the street. Who was he, Dad? I pressed. Why does his name keep coming up? Why does Jonathan Reed care? And why does this book of yours have the same crest as his ring? For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. Not the everyday kind, not the quiet dread of medical bills or slipping health. This was something older, deeper. You were never supposed to carry this weight, Maya, he said. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I let it die with me, you could live untouched. My throat tightened. But you didn't let it die. You kept the book. You told me never to lose it. That it mattered. He coughed, the effort shaking his frail body. I steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. His fingers, thin and cold, clutched mine. That book belonged to Daniel, he admitted finally. A man I once knew. He wasn't family, not by blood, but he carried a truth bigger than both of us. He gave it to me when I was young, when I thought the world was honest. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. What truth? His gaze drifted toward the ceiling as though searching for words carved there. Daniel wasn't who the world believed him to be. He was cut out, erased, made into a villain by powerful men. He trusted me with proof that the empire they built was never theirs alone. He told me to guard it, because one day it would matter. I didn't understand then. I only knew he looked like a man carrying a coffin on his back. The machines hummed steadily, but my pulse raced. Pieces of Jonathan's words, the ring, the photograph, all of it started weaving together. Is that why we were always moving? I asked. Why you never stayed long in one job, one town? His silence was an answer. Shame flickered across his face. They watched us, he said at last, voice barely audible. The Reeds, their allies. They wanted to make sure Daniel's story never resurfaced. When I took the book, I inherited more than paper. I inherited danger, and I dragged you into it. I shook my head, though tears burned my eyes. No, Dad, you were protecting me. But inside, I knew the truth. Protection and secrecy had become the same thing, and secrecy has a way of bleeding down through generations. He squeezed my hand weakly. Promise me something, Maya. Don't let them twist the story again. If Reed came to you, it means the past is clawing its way back. Be careful. Truth is heavy, and men with power hate carrying it. I swallowed hard, unable to answer, because in that moment I realized something he hadn't said out loud. The book wasn't just history. It was leverage, and men like Jonathan Reed didn't seek answers. They sought control. As my father drifted back to sleep, the machines keeping their stubborn rhythm, I sat in the half-dark with the photograph in my lap. My hands shook, not just from fear, but from the weight of inheritance. I had come searching for comfort. Instead, I had found a door creaking open to a story larger than my father's frailty, larger than my grief. A story that demanded to be heard. And for the first time, I wondered if Jonathan Reed and I were not enemies at all, but two unwilling heirs of the same buried truth. The night after my father's confession, I couldn't sleep. The hospital's fluorescent glow still clung to my skin, and every sound in my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, felt like echoes of the machines that kept him alive. I pulled the book from its hiding place. The leather was cracked, its cover worn smooth from years of being held, opened, shut, hidden again. My father always called it just a keepsake. But now I knew it was more than that. It was a vault. I set it on my kitchen table, the one piece of furniture I had never been able to replace since college. The lamplight slid across the cover, catching the faint crest embossed in the corner. I traced it with my fingertip, the same crest I'd seen glinting on Jonathan Reed's ring. For years, that symbol had meant nothing to me. Now it whispered of things stolen, names erased, a history rewritten by those who had the power to dictate which truths were allowed to live. As I opened the book, the scent of old paper and ink rushed out, sharp and familiar. And with it came memories. I was 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the floor while my father read to me. Not fairy tales, not nursery rhymes, always passages from this very book. He never told me the author's name. He just said the words mattered. You see, Maya, he'd whisper, this is about building and guarding. One cannot exist without the other. At the time, it meant nothing. I thought it was just one of his lessons, the way fathers sometimes invent wisdom to make a child listen. But tonight, I heard his voice in a new way, and it chilled me. Builder, guardian, two halves of a story. I flipped through the brittle pages, The margins were filled with notations in two different handwritings, one neat and angled, the other rough, almost desperate. On one page, the ink had bled into the paper, forming words I had never noticed before. To the one who carries what cannot be spoken, keep it, or all is lost. The sentence shook me. I remembered the night my father gave me the book outright, the night before my first year of college. We were sitting on the porch, crickets singing, the summer air heavy with heat. He pressed the book into my hands, his eyes shadowed. "Whatever happens to me," he said, "do not let go of this. It's worth more than money, more than comfort. Someday, you'll see why." I hadn't believed him. I tucked it into a box under my bed, forgot about it except on the rare nights he asked to see it, as if to remind himself it was still safe. Now, reading those words in the margin, I realized he hadn't been exaggerating. He had been warning me. I turned another page and froze. There, tucked between sheets of parchment, was something I had never seen, a folded scrap of paper, browned with age. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. It was a letter, written in a hand I didn't recognize. To Owen. "They will call me a traitor. Let them. The truth is heavier than my name. Guard it as I cannot. If ever the crest is seen again, it will mean the wound has not healed. Do not trust the heirs of fire. They burn what they fear. Owen." The name leapt from the page like a ghost. My father's middle name was Owen, but the letter felt older, written decades before he was even born. I sat back in my chair, the room suddenly too small. My father had said Daniel entrusted him with the book. But here was proof that Daniel had written to someone named Owen, a man who came before us, whose role in this web I couldn't yet understand. The words "heirs of fire" circled in my mind, unsettling and strange. I imagined Jonathan Reed standing in the library, the ring on his finger glowing under the harsh lights. Was he one of them? Was I staring into the very legacy Daniel had warned against? I closed the book, but the letter remained clutched in my hand. I thought about my father's face when he spoke of danger, of being watched. Maybe he wasn't exaggerating. Maybe his entire life had been lived under the weight of someone else's shadow. As dawn crept in through the blinds, I understood one thing with startling clarity. I could no longer pretend this was just my father's burden. The book, the letter, the crest. They had all found their way to me. And if Jonathan Reed believed he was the rightful heir to this history, then our paths were bound to collide again. I slipped the letter back into the book and whispered to the empty room, as if my father could hear me from his hospital bed. "I won't let them burn what you kept alive." The words hung in the air like a vow. I thought I could hide from him. After finding the letter, after hearing my father's broken confession, a part of me wanted to stay silent, to protect what little peace we had left. But silence is its own kind of betrayal, and I couldn't carry that weight anymore. So when the community center announced a fundraising dinner and I saw Jonathan Reed's name on the list of guests, I knew it was time. My hands shook as I ironed the plain black dress I'd borrowed from a friend, but my heart had already decided. This was the night. The hall smelled of polished wood and expensive wine. Volunteers moved nervously among the guests, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, while men in tailored suits and women in sequined gowns traded stories about stocks, developments, and promises for Detroit's bright future. I felt like a ghost among them, invisible yet burning with the truth no one wanted to hear. And then I saw him, Jonathan Reed, standing beneath a chandelier, laughing politely with a councilman, his presence so controlled it felt rehearsed. The ring flashed as he lifted a glass, the same crest that haunted the pages of my father's book. I stepped forward before I lost my courage. Each click of my shoes on the polished floor sounded like a countdown. He saw me coming. His smile faltered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I caught it. Miss Callahan, he greeted, his voice steady, smooth. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here either, I answered. My words were sharper than I intended. But we need to talk. He studied me for a long moment, then excused himself from the councilman. We moved to a quieter corner near the old piano, its keys locked and yellowed with time. What is it you think you found? He asked, his voice low, almost a growl under the music of the gala. I took the book from my bag. The leather looked small and fragile under the glittering lights. His eyes fell on it instantly, and for the first time I saw something crack in his composure. Not fear. Recognition. You've seen this before, I said. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened. That book doesn't belong to you, doesn't it? My fingers brushed the margin where Daniel's letter still rested. My father kept it safe for decades. He paid for it with more than you'll ever understand. And you stand there, wearing that crest like it's just decoration, when you know it ties us together in ways your public speeches never could. He leaned closer, his expression cold. Be careful, Maya. You don't know what you're holding. But I did. I knew enough. Enough to see that he wasn't just a polished politician or a wealthy man playing benefactor. He was an heir to a secret my father had guarded at great cost. My father's name was Owen Callahan, I said, my voice trembling with both fear and defiance. And he was left with scars because of men who carried that crest. So don't tell me this book isn't mine to protect. Something flickered in his eyes at the name. Owen. He tried to mask it, but the recognition was unmistakable. He knew. He straightened, adjusting his tie like armor. Your father was unfortunate, but the past is not as simple as you want it to be. I shook my head. The past is written in ink and blood, and I have both. For a moment the mask slipped. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly, as if the weight of generations pressed on him. He whispered, almost to himself. There were always two stories. Two versions of what happened. And now? I pressed. His gaze returned to mine, sharp again. Now you've stepped into something larger than you realize. If you go any further, there won't be a way back. I thought of my father's frail hand gripping mine, of the letter hidden in the book, of the way the crest seemed to follow me like an unblinking eye. Fear rose in my throat, but I forced it down. I'm not the one who should be afraid, I said. Silence stretched between us, heavy as the walls of that glittering hall. The music swelled in the background, a string quartet drowning out the sound of my racing heart. Finally, Jonathan spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate. Then prove it. Prove that your story is stronger than mine. He turned and walked back into the crowd, his shoulders straight, his ring catching the light once more. I stood frozen, clutching the book to my chest. His words were meant to dismiss me, but to me, they were a challenge. And I had already decided I would not back down. When Jonathan walked away that night, I thought the confrontation would break me. Instead, it lit something inside me, the kind of fire that doesn't let you rest until every shadow is searched. He had challenged me to prove it, and I couldn't let his words become a verdict. The following morning, I drove to my father's house. The place smelled faintly of dust and engine oil, the scent of years spent repairing machines in the garage just to keep food on the table. His presence lingered in every worn-out tool, every grease-stained rag. But I wasn't there to mourn. I was there to dig. I went through boxes stacked high in the basement. Most were filled with old invoices, manuals, and pieces of metal he never threw away. My hands turned black with dust as I searched. It wasn't until I pried open a trunk hidden behind a shelf that I found it. A slim wooden box with brass hinges. Inside was a bundle of documents tied with faded blue ribbon. They smelled of mildew and old paper, the kind of scent that carries secrets. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first sheet. It was a ledger. The handwriting wasn't my father's. The ink had browned with age, but the script was sharp, deliberate. I turned the page and froze. There it was. The crest. The same symbol from Jonathan's ring, stamped faintly at the top of the ledger as though the family wanted to brand even their records with their mark. The entries listed payments, dates, signatures. Some were ordinary, routine expenditures for construction projects and campaign funds. But then, in October 1968, one line stood out: consulting fee, O'Callahan, $50,000. My breath caught. That was my father. The handwriting confirmed it, the name written in full a few lines later: Owen Callahan. It wasn't just a ledger, it was a record of the moment Jonathan's family bought my father's silence. But there was more. A margin note, scrawled hastily in another hand. Keep watch. He may talk. The words burned into me. They hadn't only paid him, they had followed him, surveilled him, lived in the shadows of his every move. Suddenly, my childhood memories sharpened in new light. The strange car that sometimes idled near our street, the way my father always double-checked the locks, the weariness in his eyes as if he were always bracing for someone to come knocking. I felt sick. I shoved the papers back into the box, but not before I noticed something else tucked in the back. A letter sealed in an envelope. My father had never mailed it. The addressee was scribbled in shaky letters: to my daughter, if I am gone. The paper inside was fragile, almost brittle, but the words were clear. Maya, if you are reading this, I couldn't carry the truth any longer. They didn't just take my work. They made me choose between speaking out and keeping you safe. I lived with that choice every day, and it hollowed me out. But the book, and the papers with it, are proof. Proof that men with money and power decided our lives were theirs to control. If you ever find yourself strong enough, do what I couldn't. Make them answer. I sat on the cold floor, tears blurring the ink. His voice came alive through those words, heavy with shame and love all at once. When I folded the letter back, I realized this was no longer about curiosity or anger. This was about carrying forward the fight my father couldn't finish. That night, I spread the documents on my kitchen table. I highlighted the payments, the signatures, the dates. One name repeated alongside the entries: W. Reed. Not Jonathan, but his grandfather, the man whose empire had laid the foundation for everything Jonathan now stood upon. I stared at those letters, W. Reed, as if the paper could whisper back. Generations of power condensed into one name, one family, and the cost of that fortune was written in my father's silence. But now I had the ledger. The next day, I slipped copies of the pages into a folder and kept the originals hidden. If Jonathan thought he could dismiss me as a waitress or a grieving daughter, he was wrong. I had evidence. And I knew I had to face him again, not as someone begging to be heard, but as someone holding proof. When I closed the box and placed it back in the trunk, I whispered to my father's memory, "You kept me safe. Now it's my turn to make us heard." As I drove away, the folder sat heavy on the passenger seat. The city's skyline rose in the distance, glass and steel towers gleaming in the autumn sun. Somewhere inside one of those offices, Jonathan Reed believed he still held control. He didn't know yet that the ledger was out of the shadows, and I intended to put it right where the world could see it. I thought holding the ledger in my hands would bring me peace. It didn't. It only made the silence louder, heavier. Every word from my father's letter pressed against my chest. If you ever find yourself strong enough, do what I couldn't. So when the invitation arrived in my inbox, I knew it wasn't coincidence. A glossy flyer for the mayor's annual community banquet, an evening of polished speeches and expensive suits, with Jonathan Reed at center stage. It was meant to showcase his power, his reach. For me, it was the stage where truth belonged. The night of the banquet, I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the same locket my mother had worn in old photographs. I wasn't dressed to impress. I didn't have the money for that. But I was dressed to be remembered. Simple black dress, clean lines, nothing that would distract from my voice. I tucked the folder of copied pages into my bag. The originals remained hidden at home, like a lifeline. If they tried to silence me, they couldn't destroy everything. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and false laughter. Tables draped in linen stretched across the floor, glasses filled with wine I couldn't pronounce. The air smelled of perfume and ambition. I felt out of place, but that was the point. Sometimes the truth has to walk into the wrong room to be heard. Jonathan was across the room, surrounded by city officials and business leaders. He looked untouchable in his tailored suit, but I saw something no one else there could see: the ring on his finger, and the cracks it represented. When the speeches began, I waited. He took the podium, his voice smooth, commanding. He spoke of progress, of community, of a future built on trust. The audience nodded, applauded, lifted their glasses. And in that moment, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I rose from my seat. My voice carried sharper than I expected. Trust? I said, loud enough for heads to turn. What about the trust broken 50 years ago when your family bought silence with blood money? The room froze. Jonathan's eyes locked on mine. People whispered. A few gasped. He cleared his throat, still calm. Excuse me, miss. I stepped forward, pulling the folder from my bag. My hands didn't shake this time. I laid the copies on the table nearest the stage, where cameras could catch them, where everyone could see. My father was Owen Callahan. This ledger shows the payment your grandfather made to bury his invention and his voice. And here, I lifted the letter, the ink trembling in the light. Here is the proof of what it cost him: his health, his dignity. His life. Murmurs swelled through the room. People craned their necks, eyes darting between Jonathan and me. For the first time since I'd met him, his mask slipped, his jaw tightened. He stepped down from the podium, his shoes echoing against the polished floor. When he reached me, he spoke low, but the microphone caught every word. You think parading old papers makes you righteous? His voice was cold, but I saw the flicker of doubt. You don't know the whole story. I met his gaze, steady. Maybe not. But I know enough to say this. Power without accountability is theft, and my family paid the price. A silence followed, heavier than applause, heavier than outrage. The kind of silence where people realize a truth they can't unhear. One of the reporters rushed forward, snapping photos of the documents on the table. Another pulled out a recorder, shoving it toward Jonathan. Questions tumbled through the air. Is this true? Did your family suppress an invention? Was there intimidation involved? Jonathan's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. That was all the confirmation the crowd needed. I gathered the papers, my heart pounding, and turned to leave. But before I could, his voice stopped me. Maya, he said, using my name for the first time in public. If you want answers, meet me tomorrow. Alone. Gasps rippled through the room. His words were half an admission, half a challenge. But to me, they were a door cracking open. I walked out of the ballroom into the cool night air, the city buzzing just beyond the glass doors. I clutched the folder to my chest. Tonight, I had broken the silence. Tomorrow, I would walk into the storm. The next morning, Detroit felt different. The city was the same: gray sidewalks, impatient traffic, neon lights flickering above the corner store. But something in the air had shifted. People on the bus were whispering over folded newspapers, the headlines carrying words I never thought I'd see linked to my name. Mayor confronted over family scandal. Mysterious ledger surfaces. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground trembling under my feet. When Jonathan Reed asked me to meet him alone, I knew it was more than a conversation. It was a test. Maybe even a trap. Still, I went. Some truths demand courage, not comfort. He chose a quiet cafe far from downtown, the kind of place where the floor creaked and the coffee came in chipped mugs. No entourage, no cameras, just him, already waiting at the corner table, staring into a cup of untouched black coffee. I sat across from him, the folder heavy in my bag. "You're bold," he said finally, his voice lower than it had been the night before. Standing up in front of the entire city, accusing my family, that took nerve. "It wasn't nerve," I answered. "It was survival." My father deserved better than silence. He studied me, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in. "You want justice, I understand. But justice is complicated. My grandfather built this city's skyline, its schools, its hospitals, thousands of jobs, billions in growth. Are you ready to tear all of that down for the sake of a story buried in the past?" His words stung because they weren't entirely false. I thought of the glass towers, the union paychecks, the scholarships under the Reed Foundation. But then I thought of my father, bent over a workbench, his hands trembling with failure he never deserved. "What good is progress?" I said, "if it's built on theft?" He sat back, eyes narrowing. "So what do you want? Money? A settlement? I can arrange more than enough to clear your mother's medical bills, to give you a life without worry. Walk away now, and you'll never have to think about this again." The offer hung in the air like poisoned honey. For a brief, shameful second, I imagined it. The hospital bills gone, the weight lifted. Maybe even a chance to start over somewhere far away. But then I remembered the letter, my father's fragile handwriting. Do what I couldn't. I shook my head. "You think this is about me buying comfort? It's not. It's about truth. My family's silence killed him. I won't let yours do the same." For the first time, his mask cracked, not into anger, but something closer to weariness. He ran a hand over his jaw. "You're so certain you have the moral high ground. But you don't know the whole story. My grandfather may have stolen, yes, but he also feared someone else. A man named Daniel. That's the name I found in his papers. Daniel was the ghost that haunted him. And somehow, your father was tied to that ghost." The name jolted me. Daniel. My father had mentioned that name only once when I was a child, muttering it in a dream, followed by the words, "He gave me hope." "What do you know about him?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Jonathan looked straight at me. "I know he disappeared. I know he carried secrets powerful enough to ruin everything my family built. And I know the ring I wear." He lifted his hand, the golden band catching the cafe's dim light. "Was one of two. His brother carried the other. If your father had it, then he was part of something larger than either of us understands." I stared at the ring, my pulse quickening. All my life, I thought the ledger was the heart of the story, but maybe it was just a key to a lock I hadn't dared to touch. Jonathan lowered his hand. "I'm offering you a choice. Take the settlement and walk away. Or work with me. Help me uncover what really happened with Daniel, because if the truth comes out the wrong way, it won't just destroy my name, it will bury this city in chaos." His words were part threat, part plea. I couldn't tell which weighed heavier. I looked down at my hands. They trembled, not from fear this time, but from the weight of choice. Money, silence, and safety on one side. Truth, danger, and the chance to finish what my father started on the other. I thought of my father's voice again, the way he used to hum softly while sketching designs on the kitchen table. A melody cut short too soon. When I lifted my eyes, I spoke clearly. I don't want your settlement. But if you really mean what you said, if you truly want the truth, then I'll work with you. Not for you. With you. And only if we bring it into the light. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. Agreed. But know this, Maya. Once we open that door, there's no closing it. I leaned back, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then let's open it. The cafe door chimed as someone entered, but my eyes stayed on him. In that quiet corner, among chipped mugs and creaking floors, a dangerous alliance was born. I never thought I would walk side by side with Jonathan Reed. To me, he had always been the man in the tailored suit, the polished speech, the easy smile meant for cameras. But after that conversation in the cafe, something had shifted. We weren't allies out of trust. We were bound by necessity, pulled by the same thread of history that neither of us could cut free from. 3 nights later, I met him again, this time at a forgotten corner of the Detroit Public Archives. The building smelled of dust and rain-soaked stone. It was the kind of place most people passed by without noticing, its windows shuttered, its marble steps cracked. But Jonathan had keys. Of course he did. Inside, the air was heavy with age. Rows of filing cabinets stood like sentinels, their labels faded. Stacks of boxes leaned precariously against the walls. He led me to a locked room in the basement, the light bulb overhead buzzing like a tired insect. This is where the city keeps the records that don't fit anywhere else, he said, turning the key. My grandfather's correspondences, old property deeds, notes no one's bothered to digitize. If Daniel existed in any official capacity, his name should appear here. We pulled boxes onto the table. At first it felt hopeless. Yellowed receipts, brittle photographs, meeting minutes scrawled in neat cursive. Hours passed in silence except for the sound of paper sliding against paper. Every so often I caught him glancing at me, maybe wondering if I'd lose faith, if I'd crumble under the weight of nothingness. But then, tucked between 2 ledgers, I found a sealed envelope, its wax cracked with time. Across the front, a name written in bold strokes, D.O. Pierce. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were letters, some in French, some in English. I spread them out on the table, my eyes tracing the words. The first one stopped me cold. To Owen, the only man who understood. If they erase me, let this ring remind you that dreams are worth more than dynasties. I looked up at Jonathan, and for the first time his composure faltered. His grandfather's ghost was speaking directly to us. We read on. The letters told fragments of a story. Daniel Pierce had been cast out not for betrayal, but for refusing to surrender an invention, an idea that could have changed the course of industry. He had sought refuge with my grandfather, Owen, who had faced the same fate decades later. 2 men from different generations, bound by the same wound. Jonathan leaned over the papers, his jaw tight. If this is true, then everything I was told about Daniel, about my family's honor, it's all a lie. I touched one of the signatures, the ink smudged as if written in haste. It's more than a lie. It's a pattern. Your family silenced Daniel. Then they silenced Owen. And I can't help but wonder how many more voices were buried along the way. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of history pressed down, suffocating, unrelenting. Then Jonathan did something unexpected. He took off his ring, the golden band with its etched emblem, and placed it beside the letter. 2 rings, he murmured, 2 stories, and now 2 witnesses. His gesture wasn't surrender, it was recognition. We copied the documents, storing the originals carefully back in their envelope. As we locked the room again, I noticed something else. A box pushed into the far corner, labeled Property Seizures, 1960 to 1970. Jonathan hesitated when I pointed to it. That's not what we came for. Maybe not, I said. But my father's designs vanished around that time. If the city seized anything tied to him, it might be in there. We pulled it out. The cardboard groaned, threatening to fall apart. Inside, folders bore names of families I'd never heard of: immigrants, small inventors, working-class dreamers, all of them stripped of patents, land, or businesses for the greater good. It wasn't just my family. It wasn't just Daniel. It was dozens, maybe hundreds of lives. I felt sick. My father had carried his shame like it was personal, like he had failed. But the truth was so much crueler. He was one of many casualties in a war waged quietly under the banner of progress. Jonathan saw it too. His face hardened, his voice a whisper. If this comes out, it won't just be about my grandfather. It'll be about every promise this city was built on. I closed the folder, my resolve sharper than ever. Then it's time the city learns what its foundations are made of. We left the archives together, carrying copies of the letters and the weight of a century's secrets. For the first time, I realized Jonathan wasn't just protecting his family's name anymore. He was protecting his own conscience. And for me, it was no longer about clearing my father's memory. It was about giving voice to every silenced dreamer who had been erased. As we stepped into the cold night air, the streetlights hummed above us. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We're in this now," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "All the way." I thought the letters were enough. Proof of betrayal, proof of theft, proof of a legacy built on silencing the powerless. But there was one more page, folded so tightly it had escaped my eyes the first time. I found it while we were back at Jonathan's office, the city skyline stretching like a crown of steel and glass behind him. The paper was different, thinner, nearly translucent. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a scrawl of ink. But when I held it to the desk lamp, words emerged. The second book is not lost. It carries the true record. I leave it in the care of the guardian. Initials O.C. My heart raced. O.C. My father, Owen Callahan. I looked up at Jonathan, the letter trembling in my hands. "Do you see this? He wasn't just writing to my grandfather. He entrusted him with something." A book. Jonathan took the paper, his brow furrowing. "A second book. If Daniel kept one copy of his work hidden, then your father must have had it all along. That means it's still out there." The room seemed to close in. For years, I thought the only thing my father had left me was debt and silence. But what if he had hidden more? A book that carried the truth Daniel Pierce died trying to protect. I felt an ache in my chest, the kind that comes when memory collides with revelation. I remembered nights as a child when my father would sit at the kitchen table, papers spread around him, a battered leather notebook always within reach. He never let me touch it. He guarded it like it was something holy. After his death, I searched for it everywhere. It was gone. Jonathan's voice broke through my thoughts. If the book exists, it's the key. Not just to clearing your father's name, but to proving the dynasty was built on stolen genius. That's bigger than both of us. I turned toward the window, the lights of Detroit flickering like restless ghosts. "The last time I saw it," I whispered, "he was putting it inside the wall behind our kitchen shelves. I thought it was paranoia. Maybe it was protection." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city roared below, but up here it was just silence, and two people chained to a truth too heavy to ignore. Finally, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Then we go find it." I almost laughed. "You? A sitting mayor sneaking into a crumbling house on the east side? The cameras would have a field day." But he didn't smile. "If we don't go together, neither of us has a chance. Alone, This story can be buried again. Together, maybe it stands a chance. His words landed heavier than he intended, because he was right. I had seen how easily truth could be suffocated, how power could turn silence into permanence. The book wasn't just mine to uncover, it was ours to defend. That night, as I drove back to my mother's house, the shadows on the street felt sharper. The hum of the streetlights seemed louder. I kept hearing Daniel's words echoing in my head. Dreams are worth more than dynasties. At the kitchen table, my mother was dozing, her breath shallow but steady. I kissed her forehead and slipped into the old pantry where the shelves sagged with years of canned goods and forgotten boxes. I ran my fingers along the back panel, half afraid, half hopeful. And there it was, a faint seam in the wood, a hollow space. With trembling hands, I pried it open. Dust poured out, but behind it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My knees nearly gave out. I pulled it free, unwrapping it slowly like it might vanish if I moved too fast. Inside was a leather-bound book, the cover cracked, the spine brittle. Across the front, faint but still visible, were two initials: D.P. Daniel Pierce. I clutched it to my chest, tears burning my eyes. After all the years of doubt, after all the accusations, here it was. Proof. Not just of betrayal, but of survival. Daniel had left his truth behind, and my father had carried it like a torch in the dark. I wanted to wake my mother, to show her, but fear held me back. If this book was what I thought it was, then anyone who once tried to bury it might try again. Instead, I slipped it into my bag, my hand still shaking. When I met Jonathan the next day, I placed it on his desk without a word. His eyes widened. He ran his hand over the cracked leather like it was both sacred and dangerous. "This," he said softly, "changes everything." And I knew he was right. But I also knew something else. The moment we opened that book, our lives would never be the same. The night of the gala arrived like a storm I couldn't outrun. Detroit's grandest hotel stood lit against the night sky, chandeliers glowing through its tall arched windows. Inside, the city's elite gathered in glittering gowns and tailored suits, sipping wine as if history wasn't about to collapse around them. I walked in through the service entrance, my dress simple compared to the sea of diamonds and silk. Jonathan was already there, shaking hands, smiling his politician's smile. But when his eyes met mine across the room, I saw the weight we both carried. In my bag, the book felt like a heartbeat. Heavy, alive, dangerous. The theme of the evening was legacy and renewal. How fitting, I thought, for a night when legacy itself was about to be put on trial. Jonathan took the stage first, his voice carried with practiced confidence, thanking donors, praising the city's resilience. The crowd nodded along, unaware that each word was just a prelude. My palms sweated as I gripped the strap of my bag. Then his tone shifted. "Legacies," he said, pausing, "are often told as polished stories, stories that shine so bright they hide the cracks beneath." Murmurs rippled through the room. Faces leaned in. He glanced toward me, then continued. "For years, we've celebrated the Pierce Foundation as a symbol of strength. But strength means nothing if it's built on silence and stolen voices." The room stiffened. I stepped forward, my legs trembling but steady enough to carry me onto the stage beside him. Gasps rose from the crowd. I wasn't supposed to be there. To them, I was no one. A volunteer. A stranger. Jonathan held out his hand, and I placed the leather-bound book in it. The ballroom fell silent as he raised it, the cracked spine catching the chandelier's light. "This," he said, his voice lowering, "is the second volume of Daniel Pierce, a man erased from history so that another could claim his genius. Tonight, the truth speaks." Gasps turned into whispers, whispers into sharp edges of disbelief. Faces in the front row. Bankers, trustees, descendants, tightened with panic. And then, like a predator stepping out of the shadows, Robert Pierce rose from his table. His smile was thin, venom dressed in charm. "This is outrageous," he said loudly, his voice booming across the room. "Some waitress and a mayor with political ambitions think they can rewrite history with a dusty journal? This is nothing but a stunt." The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes darting between him, Jonathan, and me. I stepped closer to the microphone, my voice shaking but clear. "My father was entrusted with this book. He kept it hidden because he knew men like you would try to bury it again. Every page holds designs, letters, and signatures that match records your family has locked away. It's proof not just of theft, but of intimidation." Robert laughed, sharp and cruel. "Do you hear yourself? Conspiracy theories and bedtime stories. That's all this is." But Jonathan was ready. He tapped the podium, and suddenly the giant screens meant to project slides of donations flickered. Instead, high-resolution images filled the ballroom. Daniel's handwriting, engineering sketches, and at the bottom of one page, initials identical to the ones in archived patents. Proof of the stolen turbine design. The room erupted. Some gasped, others shouted. I saw a trustee's wife press a hand to her mouth. Another man stormed out, phone already pressed to his ear. Robert's mask cracked. He slammed his hand on the nearest table, his voice dropping into rage. "You have no idea what you've unleashed. This family built this city. Without us, none of you would even be standing here." Jonathan's voice cut like steel. No city should be built on lies, and no family's name should weigh heavier than the truth. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hang suspended in silence, as if the chandeliers themselves were waiting to shatter. I could feel my mother's presence in that silence, even though she wasn't there. Her warnings, her sorrow, the weight she carried, it all converged in this single breath. I wasn't just defending her. I was defending every silenced voice behind her. Then it happened. Robert, red with fury, lunged toward the podium. Security intercepted him halfway, his shouts echoing like an animal cornered. Cameras flashed. Reporters who'd been invited for puff pieces suddenly smelled blood. In that chaos, Jonathan raised the book high above his head. "The truth is no longer hidden," he declared. "Tonight it belongs to everyone." The room erupted again, but this time it wasn't disbelief. It was the sound of history cracking open. I stood there, trembling but unbroken, realizing that everything had shifted. There was no going back to silence. And yet, in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't the end. Exposing the lie was only the beginning. When the ballroom emptied that night, the air outside felt like another world. Cold, damp, and strangely quiet compared to the storm we had unleashed. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices overlapping, microphones flashing like fireflies, but I walked past them as if I were invisible. My legs shook, my heart pounded. Yet deep inside, there was a stillness I hadn't known in years. Detroit's skyline glimmered in the distance, but it looked different now. Less like a monument to power, more like a living city, fragile, flawed, and finally honest. I went home to find my mother awake in her chair, a blanket across her knees. She didn't need me to explain. The television was still glowing, the evening news replaying Robert Pierce's furious outburst, Jonathan's words, and the book raised high like a torch. Her eyes glistened as she muted the sound. "You did it," she whispered. I knelt beside her, resting my head on her lap like I had when I was a child. "We did it," I said. "Dad did it. You did it, by holding on to that book all those years." For the first time, she smiled without the shadow of regret. It was small, tired, but pure. The days that followed were a blur of headlines and fallout. Robert was stripped of his seat on the foundation's board. Investigations reopened files, thought long buried. For every denial, there was a page in Daniel's book waiting to contradict it. A dynasty that had stood for a century was unraveling in real time. Jonathan Reed became both praised and vilified. Some called him a hero, others a reckless opportunist. But when I looked at him, I didn't see a mayor anymore. I saw a man who had chosen to step into the fire, knowing it might consume him. He came to see me a week later, not at City Hall, not with cameras, but at the library where this story began. He found me shelving books, the silence of the place wrapping around us like a secret. "You've changed everything," he said softly. "No," I replied, sliding a book into its place. "The truth did. We just stopped hiding from it." He paused, studying me as though seeing not just who I was, but who I had become. "The foundation is collapsing, but something new can rise. I want you to help me build it. For the ones who never got their credit. For the ones who believed integrity was worth more than gold." I didn't answer right away. Part of me still clung to the girl who poured coffee, who kept her head down. But then I thought of my father hunched over that book, the quiet sacrifice he made, and of my mother carrying his burden for decades. "Yes," I said finally, my voice steady. "If we're going to build something new, it has to be honest. It has to be for the dreamers who never got a chance to finish their work." Jonathan nodded, not with triumph, but with relief. That night, alone in my apartment, I laid the book on the table and opened to the first page. Daniel's handwriting, faded but defiant, stared back at me. His words weren't just blueprints and equations, they were confessions, questions, and fragments of hope. He hadn't written for glory, he had written to be remembered. I traced a finger over the ink and thought about the strange chain of lives this book had touched. Daniel, my father, my mother, me. None of us had chosen this legacy, but somehow we had become its guardians. As dawn crept through the blinds, I whispered into the quiet, "It's safe now. They can't bury you anymore." The book stayed where it belonged, not in a vault, not in someone's pocket, but in the light. And me? I was no longer just the girl who stumbled upon a secret. I had walked through fire and carried my family's truth with me. The city might forget in time, people always do, but I wouldn't. Because I had learned something that night at the gala, something no headline could capture. Truth doesn't shatter when you speak it aloud. It rises, like a phoenix, and so would we.